All right, the Weissmans are on. I guess we could begin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, we will look at a very famous topic tonight that we spent the Daf Yomi for Rosh Hashanah a few days ago, was on this concept of mitzvah aseh azman grama. The reason why the Gemara here talks about it is because it was brought up in the Mishnah when it talked about the other obligations, that kibbut al aim, and other obligations what people have between each other. And then it talked about the obligations of women. And the Gemara starts on the bottom of Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, 33b, the last line. Okay, this is very famous stuff. Kol mitzvah aseh shazman grama. So last line on Lamed Gimel Amud Beis. Ezehu mitzvah aseh shazman grama. So let's talk about examples, right? The Mishnah talks about Zman Grama. Now, in a second, we're going to explain what the word Zman Grama means, okay? But let's just try to figure out the definition based on examples, okay? Even though I think one of the rules in English is that when you define a word, you can't define it by using an example, but the Gemara at least here tries to do it. Ezer mitzvah shezman grama, sukkah, lulav, shofar, tzitzis, tefillin. 5 examples. Okay, what are some examples the Gemara says that have that are time related? Okay, sitting in a sukkah, shaking lulav, hearing shofar, putting tzitzis on, and wearing tefillin. Okay, and what are mitzvahs? Ezer mitzvahs shelo azman grama. Well, let's call that 24/7. Right, mitzvahs that are on tap 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365. Mezuzah, makeh, aveda, shiluach hakan. There are some mitzvahs that are perpetual, that never expire, for lack of a better word. Right, you always have to have a mezuzah on your house. When you build a house, you have to put a parapet. You have to build a wall around the perimeter of the house so no one falls over. That's actually a mitzvah. Returning an object, right? There's no time restraint. The mitzvah is always 24 hours a day. And the last one is sending away the mother bird, if you want the eggs, what we call shiluach hakan. Okay, so that's a little bit simple. But let's talk about mitzvah aseh shehazman grama. So we're not going to get into the specifics why. We'll talk about tefillin for a minute. The problem of tefillin, the reason why the Gemara jumps on tefillin is because tefillin has 2 problematic components that don't make it 24/7. As we know, we don't wear tefillin at night, okay? But the Gemara elsewhere in Eruvin actually discusses whether or not that's a problem. Just because we don't wear tefillin at night doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't apply at night. We may not just wear it at night. So there's a machlokas whether or not the nighttime is proper to wear tefillin. But even so, forget that discussion, says Rashi. Rashi says the problem is Shabbos, right? We know that Shabbos is called an os. It says ki os hi, beinu veinechem. Shabbos is a os. And tefillin is an os. And the problem is when you have 2 at the same time, they kind of like compete with each other, right? So you don't want that to happen. It's no good. Okay, that's at least the Gemara's explanation. The deeper explanation is the Zohar discusses, not for now, but at least there's a couple of different reasons why Shabbos we don't wear tefillin. Okay? So, and then, of course, you have the second to last example, which is tzitzis, which has to do with what we call ksus laila. Ksus laila is another word for saying pajamas, right? So they would wear a specific clothing at night. And because the pasuk says ureisem osam, you should see them. So at night, tzitzis don't have to be worn. Okay, now it's a very, very big discussion. Tosfos goes into it here. We'll just touch on it for a half a minute. There's a big discussion between the Rambam and the Rush regarding what exactly is the problem with tzitzis at night. Is it something? Is it a gavra? A gavra is a way of saying, is it that us people at night do not have to wear tzitzis, period? It doesn't exist at night. Or, as the Rush learns, it's not the person, it's the article of clothing, right? That doesn't have to have tzitzis on. So if you would have an example where a person would decide to wear pajamas during the day, according to the Rambam, right, he says it's not the article of clothing, it's the person. So in the afternoon, we don't care what you're wearing, says the Rambam. You have to wear tzitzis even if it's your pajamas. The Rush says just the opposite. It's not the person, it's the article. So clothing designated for the night, i.e. pajamas, is an example where you don't have to wear tzitzis on the pajamas. So that is a real, in a nutshell, a discussion about the deeper understanding of what the exemption for tzitzis is. So we explained a little bit what the word grama means. Okay, so far you see that the word grama literally means time-bound mitzvos. If you look in the Rambam actually talks about this concept in a place you would never believe. He talks about it in the laws of Avodah Zarah. He happens to talk about it in the laws of Avodah Zarah because part of the 12th chapter in the Mishnah Torah, the laws of Avodah Zarah, has to do with a topic that we see on Lamed Hey about cutting off your corners of your hair, right? The payas. So it talks about shaving around your head and shaving the corners of your beards. And because it talks about that, the Rambam happens to say, well, that's a exception to the rule. And this is exactly what the Mishnah said on Daf Lamed or Daf Chavtes, is that when it comes to shaving your corners, right, underneath your temple, so that is an exception to the rule that a woman is chayiv in all the lavin, because there's a few that they aren't chayiv in. And once he's discussing that, the Rambam happens to say, I am in the Rambam, the 12th chapter, the third law, in the Rambam of Hilchas Avodah Zarah, Kol mitzvahs lo taseh shebetorah echad anashim v'echad anashim chayiv chut mi bal tashchis ubal takif ubal yitama lekohen lemesim. Right. The third example is that a female kohen doesn't have the prohibition like a male does of not attending funerals. That is not incumbent on a woman kohen. And then the Rambam ends off by saying, "V'chol mitzvah aseh shehi mizman lizman ve'eno tadira." So the Rambam doesn't quote verbatim the term that the Mishnah says as zman grama. He actually explains what zman grama means. He says, first of all, it's mizman lizman, which already is a hint to saying it applies from time to time, meaning it's not consecutive. It's not 24 hours straight. There's a break. That's the first criteria the Rambam describes. And the second, he says, ve'ena tadira, and it's not tadir. It's not consistent. It's not constant. It comes and it goes. It comes and it goes. Okay? So the Rambam already tips his cap or tips his hand to what the definition of mitzvah sasesha of the terms man grama or not. Okay, so that's the Rambam. If you look in the Ramban, Nachmanides, the Ramban, when he comments on our Gemara, he goes a little bit further. Okay, he talks about our Gemara and he says, well, there's a list the Gemara says, true, but he expands on the list. And part of the problem is that he falls into a trap, the Ramban, and he actually calls something a mitzvah aseh she'ein hazman grama, that we're going to scratch our head. So let's see what he says. Further examples. I'm reading from the Ramban. He says, "V'yisaver she'ein hazman grama sha'yariya u'b'mitzvah." Okay, he's talking about things that the Gemara didn't mention. U'b'mitzvah aseh she'ein zman grama, non-time bound mitzvos shayar tuva. There's many more the Gemara could have said, right? We just said mezuzah and makkah and aveda, shiluach hakan, 24/7 mitzvos. What are other mitzvos? Mora, right? The kibbud, right? Honoring your parents. Bikurim, okay, bikurim. Chala, I'm reading from the Ramban. Kisui hadam, right? So far, so good. Reshis hagez, matanos. Okay, again, these are mitzvos that are not time bound. Okay, let's leave alone bikurim for now. Okay, here's the problem: Sfiras haomer, prika, te'ina, pidyon, peter, chamor. Okay, leave Sfiras haomer alone for now. Prika and te'ina are loading and unloading an animal, right? You see your friend's animal in distress, you have to help the animal. It doesn't matter if it's a weekday, if it's a weekend, if it's a bank holiday, if it's midnight. It doesn't matter what time you see your neighbor's animal. So here's a head scratcher. Sfiras haomer. Okay, Sfiras haomer is a very funny example, because if someone were to ask me, give me, right, what was that, Family Feud, where they survey 100 people, right? If they ask someone, what is a mitzvah off the top of your head that would be the biggest example that is time-bound, I would venture to say that most people's first guess would probably be Sfiras haomer, because you don't do Sfiras haomer in the winter, right? You do it for 7 weeks, and then that's it. Ironically, the Ramban actually uses it as an example of something that the Gemara could have said is a mitzvah aseh she'ein hazman grama. So the question is, how in the world does he get away with that? So just to let you know, there happens to be a discussion whether he actually meant it or not. It could be a mistake. Maybe he was referring to the sphere that a Zav does, that it has to count 7 days. That's one way around it. But the Avnei Nezer actually asked that question, and in answering it, he comes up with a different explanation of what the word Zman Groma means. So I'm reading from the Avnei Nezer, right? He quotes the Gemara, he quotes Orach Chaim, Shin Pei Dalid, Asher Hukshalo b'divrei haramban shemana sfiras haomer b'chlal mitzvos she'ein hazman grama. Right? So the Avnei Nezer quotes the Ramban, who counts it in the list that is not time-bound mitzvos. These are mitzvos that are 24/7. V'ha'inyan pla'i. He says, this is very hard to believe. So the Efshar Sfira Leila Ramban, the answer could potentially be the Omer lo talsa Torah bizman atzmo shemakriven bo. He says, well, what does the Sfiras HaOmer represent? What is the Omer? The Omer doesn't mean to count. The Omer was actually the barley mincha that was bought on the 16th day of Nisan, i.e. Machras HaShabbos, the day after Yontif, which today in America would be the second day Yontif, or in Israel would be the first day Chol HaMoed. They would bring a korban that day. And as we learned today in Daf Yomi, Daf Lamed Zayin, the halachic significance has to do with Chadash versus Yashan, right? The new food for the new year, right? It had to have taken roots, right? Before or after, depending on how you look at it, right? The turning point is that day. So that's, right? And that's what the Omer lets you eat. Once you bring the Omer, then you could eat Chadash. You could eat the produce of that year. Okay, and in the Beis Hamikdash, you could then eat only after the Shtei Halechem is bought. That was the significant day in the Beis Hamikdash. But anyway, so getting back to our point, he says so because says the Avnei Nezer, because Firas HaOmer really talks about the Omer, so therefore the Omer was brought on the 16th day of Nisan. Rak mimachor Shabbos imken ein zman kazayin b'Nisan gorem. It could be bought any time during that day. So because it could be bought any time during that specific day that the Torah allows, again, the Torah allows it to be bought on one day, but it doesn't matter when exactly it's brought on that day. So because it doesn't matter when it could be bought on that day that the Torah allows, it's not called Zman Grama, which opens our eyes a little bit to the explanation of, so it has to do with what the Torah defines as an allowable day. So now that we know that, we could start to build definitions and other approaches by analyzing a couple of more mitzvos. Okay, there are two other, let's call controversial mitzvos. One is smicha, okay, and one is kiddush levana. So let's look at those two mitzvos. Right, smicha is the mitzvah that when you bring a korban, you have to do vidui, and when you do vidu, you literally lean on the animal. Okay, so I am reading from the Turei Even. Okay, the Turei Even, who is AKA the Shagas Aryeh, he brings down in Maseches Chagiga the Gemara that talks about who does smicha? A man. If a woman brings a korban, they don't have to do smicha. So Tosfos asks a question: why do I need the Torah to tell me Bnei Yisrael can do and Bnei Yisrael can't? I don't need the Torah to go out of its way. We have a general rule that that smicha, all things that the Havli mitzvah says man grama. Why? Because smicha is done only during the day. It's not done at night. So I don't need a special Gzeres HaKasuf to teach me that women can't do smicha. I already know from the general rule that it's a mitzvah sashay shehazman grama. So that's what Tosfos asks. So in order to understand or get a better understanding of what zman grama means, so the Shagas Aryeh says, Kol heichesh shehazman hakavua la hu kavua v'omed be'inyan kisha'avar hazman azdala lagamre. He says that what really is going on over here is because when you have a mitzvah, if you have any action which is dependent on time and it's set, and it's what he calls kavua, established, so once it expires, like an expiration date. So this has an expiration time. When it expires and the time passes, then the commandment expires, and it can't be made up. For example, a shofar, right? This year, we blew the shofar only on Sunday, and you could only blow the shofar until a certain time, right? After 7:30 or whatever time at night, on Sunday night, if someone didn't hear the shofar, there is no way you could make that up until next year. But next year, you have a new mitzvah. Sukkah and lulav also is in the same category. What's not in that category? A korban. Because if you miss smicha today, true, it expires when the sun goes down, but the next day you could bring the korban again. It's the same korban, it's the same mitzvah, so do smicha on it the next day. Okay, so we're broadening the definition of what zman grama means. So another example that I just mentioned is what we said is kiddush levana. So Kiddush Levana is, I think, also an interesting one because if you were guessing, right, remember back to survey says, if number one was Sfiras HaOmer, then you could possibly say number two is also Kiddush Levana. Isn't that Zman Grama? So again, we're going to come up with a similar answer. Okay. The Chachmas Shlomo in the Shulchan Aruch says, Uladaiti, he says, Ein ze inyan klal mitzvah shezman grama. The klal ze lo ne'emar rak b'mitzvah de guf ha-mitzvah shayche tamid b'chol inyan u'b'chol zman. What is this shazman grama? That's when it exists, right? You could the body is the body, meaning the item. That's what I'm looking for. The item, the action is feasible all the time. It's just that you can't do it anymore. Yes, it's in Kiddush Levana is a subsection of the mitzvah of Achodesh Hazeh Lachem, which is mitzvah number 4 in the Torah. The Sefer Chinuch talks about it. Anyways, so the punchline of the Chachma Shlomo is, he says it has to exist like matzah. He says kagon matzah o sukkah o lulav. The mitzvah zu efshar lekayim becheshvan kamo b'tishrei. The iyar kamo b'nisan. If I go into my closet, okay, and I take out matzah, okay, in June, I'm having a picnic. Now the Torah says, hey, I have news for you. You're not going to be lekayim a mitzvah in June by eating a kazayas matzah when you go on a picnic. But matzah still exists. It's still in a box. You could have your lulav in Cheshvan also if you want, and in Kislev. No one's stopping you. So therefore, what? The chalos, you don't actually get credit for the mitzvah, but it's still in existence way after the expiration date. As opposed, where are we going with this? As opposed to the moon. Because on the 15th day, for example, of any given month, when you look up, you don't see the moon anymore that you could make a bracha on. You see a full moon. A full moon is not like a box of matzah, because a box of matzah exists, and you could, if the time were right, be yotzei a mitzvah. But from the 14th to the 29th of the month, the mitzvah doesn't exist anymore, meaning the moon is not in a situation that you could make a bracha on it. So that, the way the Marshal, not the Marshal, the Chachma Shlomo explains, is the difference why the moon is not even in a category of Zman Grama. Okay? So I thought that was very, very interesting. Right? The words are in Hebrew, Aval Bilvana, Atu have leminiya mikoach hazman. Ze have heminiya migufa mitzvah shelo shaycheaz. It's not a problem of timing. It's a problem of it doesn't like matzah in June would be. It's a problem, he says, Zoha miniyah, the restraint is miguf ha-mitzvah shelo shaycheaz. It doesn't exist. The moon is full. Because you already were supposed to make the bracha from the 3rd of the month to the 14th of the month, according to most opinions, right? So that's it. You got to wait until the next month. So I thought that was a beautiful way in at least understanding this concept that we hear all the time of Zman Grama, Zman Grama. And once you understand the definition, you're like, oh, now I understand why Sfiras HaOmer and Kiddush Levana and Smicha can be exceptions, even though they kind of boggle the mind a little bit. So I thought that was very nice. So that's part one. I think is very important to understand a definition. Now we get into a little controversy in part two, because part two, the Gemara actually doesn't give a reason why women are patur. You need opinions of commentators, not even Rishonim, not even achronim. I'm talking about like, I don't say contemporary, but very, very, very late achronim, right? There's a couple of opinions why women don't have to perform. And the key is how you say the word don't have to. Like you could tell someone, you don't have to do this. So there's two ways they could take it. You don't have to do X because you're not like the other people, or you don't have to do X because you're better than the other people. Okay, now I'm not going to say that all women are going to accept this. And I admit today that, as I said a minute ago, it's gotten a lot of fanfare in the attitude of the woman in particular who would ask the question. So it all depends. It's like most things today. It's when you ask a question and you're expecting a certain answer, like you're prepared for it. So it's all on the delivery of how you accept this answer and how the answerer puts a spin on it, right? It's like politics today, right? Everything has a spin on it depending on which side of the fence or what camp you go to or what camp you are affiliated with. So I want to start with a couple of different explanations. I'll read in Hebrew. I'm quoting from the Avudraham. Okay. והטעם שנפטרו הנשים ממצווה של זמן גרמה לפי שהאישה משובדת לבעלה לעשות צרכיו. Okay, so already we're starting with two strikes, right? Because the woman is subservient to her husband, to him. Okay? Let's say, for argument's sake, she was chayiv in all these mitzvos that are time bound. Okay? And all these mitzvahs that are time bound. Sukkah, lulav, shofar, tefillin, right? So if she was mechayiv in them, so the wife is busy putting on her tefillin, and the husband wants his coffee. So we have a conflict. She's trying to fulfill God's words, but yet her husband, for whatever reason, likes his coffee a certain way, and that commandment is done at the same time when she's wearing tefillin. So she asks herself, well, what do I do? I'm in a pickle. So in order to avoid the pickle, we say in these types of mitzvos, you don't have to do. Your overriding factor is your service, let's use that word, to your husband. And the words of the Avudraham is v'im taseh mitzvahs habore v'taniach mitzvaso, if you favor tefillin over making him coffee, oy la mi baila. Wow, you know what that means. God forbid, we should never see the consequences. So let's say if she gets the coffee and says, God, I'm putting you on hold. Okay. Then she's in trouble with God. So she's at what they call a Mexican standoff. She doesn't know which way to go. Lefichach, the Avudraham continues, Patra habora mimitzvosav. God says, you know what? I'll throw you a bone. You don't have to worry about my commandments. Kedelios shalom im baila. Ugdola mizos matzanu shashem agadol hanichta b'kedusha b'tahara nimcha al hamayim kedei lahatel shalom bein ish leishto. And the Avudraham ends off by saying, and if you think this is a foreign concept, you don't have to go further than the famous Gemara that we saw a few months ago in Daf Yomi in Sota, that God says, I'm willing to take one for the team and have my name erased by the Kohen when he spills water over the Megillah Sota in order to bring you two guys back together. So I'll end off by saying, in theory, this is a very beautiful explanation. Practically, it's up to the questioner to judge whether or not she likes this answer or not. Okay, I'll leave it at that. It's funny, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was quoted, I have it in front of me, saying something pretty similar. He says, women are freed from performing mitzvahs which are obligatory only at a specific time. The Arizal writes concerning such mitzvahs, when the male performs the mitzvah, so he has a little bit of a different spin on it. It's unnecessary that the woman should also do them separately, for she has already been included with him at the time when he does the mitzvah. It's almost like she is part of the husband. And if the husband shakes the lulav, then by proxy, the woman is also shaking the lulav. In other words, when the Torah frees a woman from certain mitzvahs, it frees her only from doing them, so that she can devote her time and energies to her unique mission. The state of wholeness and perfection that is attained and the reward that accrues from these mitzvahs does pertain to women also, through her husband performing them. Okay, a very similar concept. I want to read to you the words, which again is also similar, of the Igras Moshe. Rav Moshe Feinstein, he says, Stam nashim ba'olam enam ashiros. Okay, the average woman in the world is not rich. Va'alehen mutal gidul hayaladin v'hayalados shehi melacha hayoter chashuva l'Hashem yisbarach. So this is a little bit similar to the Avudraham. He says basically women have bigger fish to fry. They're not worried about taking a lulav or go hearing the shofar or spending 40 minutes putting on tefillin. To them, taking care, again, I'm saying this with all, with all due respect and with all comedic value on the side, because again, it all depends on the listener, on how they interpret it. Tell this to Gloria Steinem in the 60s, she would laugh at you, right? Or a woman's liber, because if their whole, mahalech is that we just want to be equal to men at all costs, don't try to feed this fill in the blank to me, because all you're doing is justifying how we don't need it, right? So again, that's why you have to be very careful how these answers are portrayed. But anyways, at least in the words of Rav Moshe Feinstein, again, he wasn't small potatoes. He said that the raising of the children, which is greater, again, greater in the eyes of God than putting on tefillin. Okay? Shegam teva hanashim misugal yoter legidol hayolam shemitzad zeh hakel alehen. Be nice to them. Shelo l'chayevin b'limudat Torah. Don't make them learn Torah. U'b'mitzvos heshezman grama. Shelaken afim yishtana siddur hachayim ba'olam gam l'chol nashim v'lashiot b'chol zmanim. He says, therefore, even in the order of life, right? If the order of life should change for all women, right, and for all the wealthy women, even when it's possible to give over children, right, to men to watch instead of women, the law will not change. So he's already saying, he's preempting, well, okay, what if you have a woman CEO, right, who doesn't have time to watch her kids, and it's a stay-at-home dad? So maybe we should flip the roles, right? The stay-at-home dad, whose job it is now to watch the children. After all, you told me that watching children is the most holy thing in God's eyes, right? Playing devil's advocate over here. So what if you have, like we have today, stay-at-home dads? Should they be doing only the mitzvah shezman grama? Okay, so that's where Moshe gets into trouble a little bit, where he says, no, it'll never change. So, take that. And just the last opinion, I saw Rav Hirsch, this is probably the most famous one. His take on it is basically, in a nutshell, women don't need it. Because the whole assumption of the question is, how come women aren't equal? But if your assumption is that they need something to be equal to men, and putting on tefillin, or taking lulav, or doing all the examples that they don't have to do, he says, no. They don't need tefillin. Men are on a lower level. So putting on tefillin elevates the man. The woman, like for example, the Gemara Nida says that women, believe it, I don't say believe it or not, but are intellectually on a higher level. It's called Bina Yetera, right? Isn't there a Bina, right? Isn't there a women's yeshiva, I think, with that name, right? It's called Bina Yetera. They have a elevated, more intellectual way of understanding things than men, right? So, but then on the other hand, The Gemara sometimes says Nashim Daitan Kalos. So it all depends. There are strengths and weaknesses. So if you take the strength, according to Rav Hirsch, he says the strength of the woman is that they just don't need tefillin for whatever reason. Now we don't understand that, but that's basically that's basically the explanation of why they shouldn't do these mitzvos. Not that they can't do them, they just don't need them. Okay, so that's three different ways of analyzing the reason why. Okay, so getting back to the Gemara goes back and forth on Daf Lamed Daled, and on Lamed Hey, we conclude basically by saying, I'll just read the Gemara. The Gemara is about a third of the way down on top. Gemara ends off by saying, it quotes the pasuk from Parshas Bo. Okay, right? On Daf Lamed Daled, it goes back and forth and says, well, how do we know the source? The source is from Tefillin, and Tefillin is connected to Talmud Torah. If the Torah specifically says, and right after that, it talks about Tefillin. So to say that women are putter from Talmud Torah is across the board. No one disagrees with that. So if you are under the assumption that no one disagrees with that, Tefillin is compared to learning Torah or Talmud Torah. And just like Talmud Torah women are putter, so too Tefillin women are putter. And because they're putter in that one aspect of Tefillin, which is not a 24/7 mitzvah that we discussed because of Shabbos or because of night, for whatever reason, so too, if Tefillin isn't, then all the others fall into the same category. And the Gemara stresses that it learns from this pasuk at the end of Parshas Bo, Laman tiyatorjan beficha, huksha kol Torah kulo tefillin matfil, mitzvah shezman grama nashim peturos, av kol mitzvah saseh shezman grama nashim peturos. So when it comes to time-bound grama mitzvos, women are putter. So what's the default? Well, if they're putter in that, then they must be obligated in everything else, right? All other mitzvos like the makeh, the fence, and the shiluach hakan, and the other examples that we brought on Daf Lamed Daled, right? And the returning the lost object, and Shiluach Hakan, and Mezuzah. All those, by default, the women are chayiv. Okay? So let's, for a moment, look at this pasuk. Okay? Because at the end of the day, the source, the ultimate source, is from the pasuk in Bo. Okay, what does the pasuk in Bo say? The pasuk says, there's actually two psukim in Bo. At the end of Bo, well, let's talk about Bo for a minute. Bo is a chock-full parsha with Bnei Yisrael finally get, right, we have Makas Bechoros, right? The Jews are told to leave Mitzrayim. We have the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazeh. Then that segues into Pesach. Pesach is all about freedom. And the Torah says regarding freedom, I'm reading from Pasuk 9, chapter 13 in Bo. V'haya lecha la'os al yadcha lu'zikaron beinenecha l'man tiyeh Torah Hashem b'ficha ki biyad chazaka hotziacha Hashem mimitzrayim. Okay, that's one pasuk. Then toward the end of Parshas Bo, the very, very last pasuk, it's repeated again. So the culmination of Yetzias Mitzrayim is Pesach, and the culmination of that is getting the mitzvah of Tefillin, which, by the way, is two separate mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah to put Tefillin on your arm, and a mitzvah to put it bein einechem. Okay, so let's look for a minute at Rashi. Okay, let's do some very simple interpretations what the pasuk means. Totafos. Okay, we all know this Rashi. This is a famous Rashi. He says Totafos means tefillin. Why? How does Totafos mean tefillin? Ve'al-shem shehem arba batim kuruyim Totafos. You have 4 compartments in your tefillin, right? The word Totafos is tet, tet, pei, tuf. Rashi quotes tat bekatfi shtayim. Tat in the language of Katpi. We could have a class on this by itself. What is Katpi? What does it mean? Where does it come from? Is it related to the Coptic language? Again, not for now. Pat, the word pat, ba'afriki, in Afriki, whatever African means, Stein. Okay, Rashi quotes this from a Gemara in the beginning of Sanhedrin. Okay, and Menachem, Rashi sometimes quotes the interpretation of his Rebbe Menachem, right? He says it comes from a word in Yecheskel, Bahatef, El Hadorom, which basically means to, right, and speak to the south, right? And that has to do with the mouth, which is a zikaron. Okay, not for now. So that's Rashi. Okay, let's look at, just again, you could go spend the whole shir on this. I just happened to find a beautiful netziv. The Hamek Davar says just regarding tefillin, because what does tefillin represent? He says Atabier. Now we understand to explain Hakli Zayin Shal Yisrael, Shehu Chozek Yad. Right, the Torah juxtaposes our totafos, and then it says at the end Ki b'chozek yad hotzianu Hashem mitzrayim. So the armor of the Jewish people, which is their chozek yad, sheyesh lekol echad miYisrael. The amar shet tefillin komo sheyesh behen koach haTorah l'shibud halev v'hamoach l'malchus shamayim, kacha yesh behem mein koach haTorah shu charbam shel Yisrael lahagen mikol tzara kasher kvar yadu mizeh. So our ultimate armor is our tefillin. Okay, so that's a very beautiful netziv on that pasuk. I thought I would bring down. Let us look at the reason, okay, for tefillin. Okay, I'm going to read now from the Sefer HaChinuch, okay, mitzvah number 421. Open up Chinuch. A minute. Sefer HaChinuch 421, mitzvahs tefillin shal yad. Okay, I'm going to skip to Misharshe HaMitzvah. What is tefillin shal yad all about? What's the root of the commandment? Lefisha ha'adam biyoter bal chomer, because people at the end of the day, right, we're physical. We go after desires. That's what we are, right? Yimash behechrech achar taivas. We follow our taivas. Ki ken teva hachomer levakish kol hanos elav v'ha'arev, right? Because at the end of the day, we seek whatever is comfortable, whatever is pleasurable, just like kesusu pered in heaven. We're no different than an animal, right? We're no different than a horse, right? All a horse wants is to eat, to sleep, right? They just want to go after things that are enjoyable. We're no different. We're no different than an animal, were it not that our soul that we got from God prevents us, right? It prevents us as much as it could from sinning. So we are almost like our default is to sin. If you want to look at it that way, we're programmed to go after desires. So therefore, we need inhibitions. We need alarms. We need warning signs to stop us every time we want to sin, because that's what our default is. Our default is to be like an animal, okay, to sin all the time. So, what is our warning sign? It's tefillin. That's what the Sefer HaChinuch says. U'masher tishkon begvulo shehi haaretz rechoka ma'od min gvula shehi hashamayim lo tucha lo v'yigbar koach alei hatamid. We're always going to get drawn to that. L'chen hitzricha al kol panim laharbe shomrim. We need shomrim around us. L'shamra mishchena hara, to distance ourselves from the bad neighbor. Pen yakum alev v'yargena. And he goes on, and basically he says, what's our shomer? Torah is our ultimate shomer. That's why we're commanded not to stop day or night, right? So what's one example? So what do we do as armor? Well, we have our tzitzis, right? Remember the story in Avodah Zarah? The person wanted to sin, right? And he looked at his tzitzis. He goes, oh, how could I sin? I'm wearing tzitzis, right? So that's, the alarm went off. In one case, the tzitzis was the alarm. Umezuzah bepischenu. What's the second alarm? A mezuzah. You go out of your house, you want to sin. What's the last thing you see when you leave the exit door? You see the mezuzah. Maybe you'll think twice about sinning. V'hatfilin bi'adenu b'roshenu. Tefillin that we wear. Now then it was worn all the time. Today we wear it barely for 35 minutes a day. But again, the tefillin is our warning sign. Right? Not to be followed by our eyes. Very interesting comment the Chinuch says. He says, if you really know, you would know that the Kohanim and Levim, when they were doing the avodah, they were put from wearing tefillin. You know why? Because they didn't need a warning sign to go off, because they were doing the avodah constantly. So they were engrossed in servicing God. Why do I need tefillin? That's exactly why they didn't wear tefillin, says the Chinuch. Okay? So that's a very beautiful interpretation of what the tefillin signify. Again, we're talking about tefillin specifically, is because tefillin is the ultimate teacher of mitzvah saseh, right, Shazman Grum. So that's why I think tefillin was picked, because, well, we're about to see the Ramban, but before we get to that, before we end off with the Ramban, the end of the Sefer HaChinuch says, let's talk about women and tefillin. Okay, so again, I'm reading the words of the Sefer HaChinuch, right? We always do a chinuch once a week. So women don't have to do it. So far, so good. Here's where he gets in trouble, because the Shulchan Aruch, or more famously the Ramah, says they not only could they not do it, they should not do it. Here, the Sefer Chinuch says, just the opposite. If a woman wants to opt in, then we let them do it. The sachar yesh lahen, and they do get reward, but keep in mind, it's not the reward like a man, because they're not mitzvah va'oseh. Avalo k'schar ha'ish she'eno domeh schar hamitzvah hamitzvah va'oseh k'schar she'eno mitzvah va'oseh. Okay, then he brings down the Gemara in Eruvin, Shemicha bas Shaul haisa menachas tefillin, right? Shaul's daughter wore tefillin. V'lomicha b'yad hachachamim. He's bringing proof to show historically where women wore tefillin and nothing, and the rabbis allowed it. And also, there was another exception, Ishto Shel Yonah, right? In Maseches Eruvin, it actually brings down in the Tosfos in the last chapter that Yonah's wife, she didn't wear tefillin, but Haisa Ola L'Regel. She did something that she didn't need to do either. She was Ola Regel. Lo michu b'yad hachachamim. Okay, so that's that. For the last 10 minutes, again, what I'm about to say deserves a 60-minute class, but I want to talk about it. It's hard to learn tefillin in Parshas Bo and not mention the word Ramban, because we're about to see, probably, by all accounts, the most famous Ramban in all of the Chumash. This is one of those, desert island questions. If you only had one Ramban a la Torah, right? And you're on an island, which one would you pick, right? Most people, if not all people, would pick the very, very last Ramban in Parshas Bo because it contains everything in it. Okay? And I'm about to show you, we're going to read some of it, and it's known as the Ramban. Like when you talk about the famous Ramban in the Torah, this is the one. And why it's so so full of information, at least for our is because, at least for our class, is because it's related to tefillin. Because remember how Parshas Bo worked. We went from the Choros to Yetzias Mitzrayim to Pesach to tefillin, and there's a crescendo, right? And it all builds up to tefillin. And the Ramban, I'm going to just start reading, right? The reason, excuse me, let's start reading from right in the middle. I'm just going to read. Okay. And just to give you a heads up that in one Ramban, just to give you an example, he talks about the Makos, why we have mitzvos regarding Pesach, what the reason is behind mitzvos. He goes back to the creation. He says everything is hashkacha, right? It all comes from God, and why all what we're doing is tied into reward and punishment. So this is almost like an introductory Ramban that could have said on the whole Torah, but the springboard is from the whole mitzvah of tefillin. So what is it about tefillin? Okay, what is it about tefillin that gets the Ramban going? So he starts off by, well, he doesn't start off, but he says over here that the Ata, Omer lecha klal b'ta mitzvahs rabos. He says, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction why we have mitzvos. And he goes on a historical journey, almost very similar. If you've ever learned the beginning of Hilchas Avodah Zarah, the Rambam talks about the days of Enosh. Okay, the days of Enosh is when all hell broke loose, and Avodah Zarah started, and people weren't God-fearing. And that's the beginning of the Rambam, if you've ever learned it in Hilchas Avodah Zarah. The Ramban takes a similar approach, and he discusses the same thing. He says, we had Amuna problems right when the door of Enosh came. Mehem kofrin be'ikr. There were three types of sinners. There were those that denied God altogether. V'omrim ki ha'olam kadmon. He says that God can create the world. Kachshu b'Hashem v'omelahu. There's no God. Umehem, then there's another group, machishin b'yediyaso hapratis. They deny his existence, but v'amru echa yada el v'yesh das be'elyon. There's some kind of God, but we're not exactly sure. Umehem sheyodu b'yediya umachishin b'hashgachaso. No, there is a God, but we don't believe that he controls everything. And what did he do? It's almost like that deism, where God created and he put everything on a clock and he left the scene, right? Different levels. He compares it, V'yasu Adam k'degei hayam shelo yashkiach ha'el bahem. It's like he let them in the pond and now we're swimming on our own. Ve'eni mahem onesh v'schar. And we don't have this concept of schar of onesh. Yomu azav Hashem esarz. God left us. Okay? So he goes on to say that that's why that's why we needed the Makos, and that's why we needed Yetzias Mitzrayim, because the Yetzia happened to show God's presence against all these claims, right? In one fell swoop, we had the miracles, we had Yetzias Mitzrayim, and that basically refuted all of those people who said that there is no God, or God is there, but he's not, too busy with humans. He's on vacation, right? Whatever they claimed the whole Yitzias Mitzrayim undermined. Right? What does it say by the 10 plagues? It says, I'm going to put the frogs, I'm going to give you kinim. Why? To show you guys that God, in fact, does exist and is very, very busy in the course of everyday nature. Lahorish al hashgacha, and that's the key word of this whole Ramban, is the word hashgacha. Ki lo azav osa lemikrim. God is not absent at times, kedaitam, like the old people used to think. Va'amar laman teda ki la Hashem haaretz. Lahoris al achidish, to say that God is always there and continuing to rule. Ki hem shalosha bara me'ein, right? V'amar bavur teda ki yen kamoni b'chol haaretz. Lahoris al yachol shu shalat bakol, to teach you that God is in charge of everything. Ein ma'akev biyado, nothing holding him back. Imken ha'otot v'hamoftim, all of the wonders and the miracles were made. Edim ne'emanim be'amuna sabor u'betorah kula. Everything went on in Mitzrayim just to show God's presence, i.e. hashgacha. Okay. Uba'avur, right? Uba'avur ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo yaseh osu moftet b'chol dor le'ena k'rasha o kofer. Then he's going to say, so what are you going to say today? I don't see any miracles today, right? I don't see miracles every day. So how do I know that God is around, right? We need some kind of, not miracle, but we need some kind of memento, right? We need a souvenir that God is always on our side. That's exactly why tefillin is right next to Yitzias Mitzrayim in the very last pasuk. Ki b'chozek yad, right? Totafos beinenecha ki b'chozek yad. That's exactly the point of the Ramban. He says, let it go on and on as a Mesorah, right? You should know, so on and so forth. He says that and it's not only, it's every single thing we do. How many times do we say Zecher L'Tzias Mitzrayim? We say it by the Kiddush, right? We say it at the Pesach Seder. Everything is right. Zecher L'Tzias Mitzrayim. V'hakol lihios lanu b'chol adoros edus b'moftim shelo yishtakfu. It all goes back to Mitzrayim as testimony, so people shouldn't forget. V'lo yihya pischon peh lekofer. It shouldn't be a pischon peh for those who doubt. Lahachish emunas elokim, to contradict God. Ki akona mezuzah b'zuz echad v'kava pischo. If you buy a mezuzah for $5 and you put it in your door, v'niskaven b'inyana kvar hode b'chidesh ha'olam, for $5, you are showing everyone this manifestation of God, will be a dias habor v'hashgacha, and his hashgacha. Okay, and the last line, or the last, really the cherry on top, is the last sentence, is the last paragraph. Umin hanisim hagedolim hamefursamim adam modeh benisim hanistarim. So he's saying very beautiful. He says that we today don't see big miracles. We see small miracles. We see things. Sometimes we say to ourselves, why did God want me to see certain things? Why did I make a left turn instead of a right turn and I saw something? What was the purpose of me taking the wrong exit and seeing somebody who I haven't seen in 30 years, right? Sometimes it's not just wondering why we don't see things, it's wondering why we do see things, right? It's not just missing, it's experiencing what we see. As for why do we see what we see? And that's what exactly what the Ramban says. He says, when you see, right, the things, right, in public, right, then right, from the big miracles that are in public, then we say, oh, how about the small miracles? The fact that every day we could wake up, right, and we could take a nap, wake up, and 5 minutes be on the road, right? Nature. He says, because if you don't agree that nature is all miracle played out by God, he calls you a kofar. And that's why this Ramban is famous for almost agreeing with the Rambam in his philosophy about, and we spoke about this once a few years ago, how do we view nature? We say it's natural. So if it's natural, means it happens, right? The sun rises, the sun sets, it's natural. But is God involved in that or not really? Or he put it on a timer and it's going to rise and set for the next 6 billion years. So that's what the Ramban says. He says, don't think that everything's that you put a seed in the ground and 2 years later you have an apple tree. Yeah, we call it today nature, but every single component of that growth, there's a hand of God. And the way the Ramban calls the hand of God over and over throughout this whole piece is what he calls hashgacha. And that's why you have to be mamin, you have to have emuna, b'chol devarenu umikrenu shekulam nisim, ein bahen teva uminak shel olam. It's not natural. It's not just automatically. Bein barabim, bein biyachid, ele im yaseh hamitzvos yatzachenu scharo, and then he talks about schar ba'onesh, and he goes on and on, v'isparsu mitzvah nistarim, and he says, V'amru kol agim al ma'asak Hashem kacha la'aretz hazos, v'amru al asher azvu es bris Hashem elokei avosam, sheisparsem adav l'chol ha'umos, shehu me'as Hashem ba'onsham. Okay, anyways, so that's really 9:00. That's really, in a nutshell, that it's all or none with the Rambam, right? It's all our hashgacha. And where does this hashgacha stem from? It stems from Yitzias Mitzrayim. And what is connected to Yitzias Mitzrayim? Tefillin. So tefillin is our, like I said before, our proof, our memento that we keep on ourselves that takes and ties this whole thing together. So I thought that's a very, very beautiful Ramban. I highly recommend for it to be read. It's, in a nutshell, everything that Judaism 101 would encompass. And on that note, any questions?